we are delighted to introduce Nomads. Moving across millennia, Anthony Sattin's latest book, Nomads, explores the transformative and often bloody relationship between settled and mobile societies. Ilse Köhler-Rollefson's Hoofprints is a timely, powerful, but also incredibly lyrical book about nomadic pastoralism and how traditional herding cultures are not a thing of the past, but a regenerative model for the future. Connecting us to mythology and records of antiquity, Sattin and Köhler-Rollefson, in conversation with historian Yashaswini Chandra, explain why we leave home and why we like to return again. I'm delighted to introduce our guests, the first of which is Anthony Sattin, who is a history and travel writer. His latest book, Nomads, The Wanderers Who Shaped Our World, has been described as important, generous, and beautifully written, and a treat for any thoughtful traveler, armchair or otherwise. Next, we have Ilse Köhler-Rollefson, a German veterinarian who has spent the last 30 years amongst pastoralist cultures. She is the author of Camel Karma and Hoofprints on the Land, among several other technical books. Lastly, we have Yashaswini Chandra, who is the author of The Tale of the Horse, A History of India on Horseback. She holds a PhD from SOAS University of London, and her research interests include the arts and cultures of the Himalaya, Rajasthan, and Mughal India, animal history, and women's studies. She is also the incoming lecturer in South Asian art history at the University of Edinburgh. We're looking forward to a fantastic session. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be in conversation with Anthony Sattin and Ilse Köhler-Rollefson about their astounding new books on nomadic pastoralism, because they highlight an integral but unsung side of history. Thankfully, we've come a long way since great man history, but historical understanding still tends to revolve around great empires and settled societies. To that extent, here are two books that challenge the conventional outlook and look past the paucity of written sources. If Anthony's Nomads reminds us of the enduring legacy of these groups to human civilization, then Ilse's Hoofprints on the Land complements its historical angle with a focus on present ecological and economic importance of the pastoralists. So my first question is addressed to the both of you. Historically, nomads have been both romanticized and vilified. But without the itinerants, there would be no long-distance trade or migration, no cross-cultural links, no oral epics conceived around campfires. The nomads have impressed upon us the importance of travel and given us a sense of adventure. We may not realize it, but they have shown us an interconnected world and can teach us to live in harmony with nature and build partnerships with animals. So how did you both fall in with nomads and pastoralists? And why did you become fascinated with their way of life? How do you pin these elusive wanderers down, considering that so little has been written about them?
Namaskar. So I got interested and I fell in love with nomads more than 30, maybe 40 years ago, because I realized they know how to keep animals sustainably in tune with local environmental resources. And I was initially attracted by their close relationship with animals, because they treat animals like members of the family and members of the household. They have an intimate relationship with them, and often the herds and the families, they have been together over generations. So this totally appealed to me. I'm an animal lover originally. I studied veterinary medicine. I was put off by the Western way of livestock keeping. And when I first encountered Bedouin nomads in Jordan and saw how they related to their camels. I was just totally floored. And that was emotionally, and now, in the meantime, I also realized how important they are also ecologically.
Well, my introduction to nomads was quite different and quite more, I think, more intellectual, but also, curiously, with the Bedouin, but not in Jordan, but in the Sinai Peninsula. And yes, most of a lifetime ago, when I was a teenager, when I was 19, and I was traveling through the Middle East, my first sort of big voyage. And I'd been told, watch out for the Bedouin, because they're going to steal from you. They're going to, and it turned out to be quite other. They were actually extremely welcoming and protective of me. And when I got back to the UK and carried on with my studies, it became increasingly clear, and then later on when I went to live in Egypt, that in the West, particularly in the UK, nomads are not part of the discussion. They're not part of history. They're not part of everyday life. But in many other parts of the world, they are. And I thought, well, that's quite curious. And so one way or another, much of what I've been interested in, what I've written about, has touched tangentially on the nomadic world. And now in this book, I've actually gone straight towards it.
Fantastic. So I'm going to ask you this question. You said that you hardly ever get to hear about nomads in Europe and such places, and your book to a large extent focuses on Asia and Africa. But presumably we all started out as nomads, you know, even in cultures where nomadism disappeared a lot more quickly. So in that case, will you explain the impulse to settle? And will you tell us what Gobekli Tepe or Portobel Hill in Turkey tells us about that? Also, if the settler model has increasingly triumphed over the nomadic one since the turn of the Christian era.
That's a
lot of questions.
That's a whole book in a question. But yes, I think, you know, until the dates are constantly changing, and this period of early history, and we're talking about 10,000 BC, is very, you know, so 12,000 years ago, the boundaries are constantly shifting. But what we know now, and this is only since the 1990s that we've known this, there's a place called Gobekli Tebia. Before that, everybody lived more or less as hunter-gatherers. Some people were more localized than others, but people roamed and they gathered. And sometime around 9,500 BC, in Turkey, down in southern Turkey near the Syrian border, a group of people settled, they created a shrine, some sort of religious complex, and it's not quite clear, we can't understand what it was that they saw in the landscape. It's sort of rolling hills, and in the distance there's a volcano. Maybe there was a huge volcanic eruption, maybe there was some sort of sign in the skies. But they decided, and these are hunter-gatherers, to build what we think is the world's first stone monument. So this is 11,500 years ago. And it's a series of T-shaped pillars, about 10 feet high, 12 of them in a circle, with two taller pillars in the middle, about 12 or 14 feet high. And not just one circle, but lots and lots of circles over a hillside. And some of them they buried, and others are not buried. But these are cut limestone. We don't know how they did it. I mean, they cut with flints, but this is quite advanced. So, but it's probably something earlier that we haven't found yet. And this site was found in 1995, and since then several other sites near there have been found. But the key thing about nomads, hunter-gatherers and settlement is that until then, as far as we know, everybody lived on the move. But in order to build this place, it seems that you can only have about 20 people per square mile as hunter-gatherers. That's sort of maximum that you can feed people. But the number of people you needed in order to build this site, you needed more than that. And I think what happened, and this is conjecture because nobody so far knows, is that in order to build the site, they had to start either bringing in food or domesticating. And the first strain of domesticated wheat has been found not far from Gobekli Tebia. So the idea is that settlement comes about because of this impulse to build a religious sacred space. And the domination of the settled, well, to compress a very, very long story into a very, very short answer, if you can only have 20 people maximum per square mile as hunter-gatherers, people living on the move, and you can put thousands of people, by the 6,000 BC, 5,000 BC, you have large settlements. Then obviously this dominance of this group of people living in one space becomes increasingly powerful, but it doesn't replace the other. And this is one of the things where in a way we've been poorly served by historians until now, because our history is all about settlement. It's always a view from inside the wall to outside. And it tends to look at people who are outside as, and I'm sure we'll come on to this later, as scary, dangerous, unwelcome. But clearly that's not the human story. The human story has always been of the coexistence, the happy coexistence of settled and nomadic peoples throughout most of history.
I think that's a very important point, because historically a lot of economies depended on both sort of settled agriculture as well as nomadic pastoralism. So to come closer to home in terms of time and space, how did you fall in with the Raika camel herders of Rajasthan, and tell us about the moral economy of these Raika herders?
Yeah, before I answer that question, I just want to expand a little bit on what you're saying, because I also worked in archaeology for quite a while, and I worked on a Neolithic site which is slightly south of the one you're describing in Jordan, where we can see that how initially, during the early Neolithic people, when they were domesticating goat, they had a rich economy, they had wonderful artwork, they lived kind of in the lap of luxury or in the Garden of Eden, and how it slowly deteriorated over 2,000 years. By about 5,000 BC, the settlement was, they didn't know how to build houses anymore. Everything was crumbling. And at that time, it was when herding was actually taken away from the settlements. At that time, we see how the eastern desert of Jordan became populated by goat herders. So this is an important lesson, that animals need to be kept on the move. If you keep them in one place around a settlement, it leads to ecological degradation. But coming back to the Raika, yes, so I came to India 32 years ago to study the Raika, because I had that affection for camels at the time, and I knew there were a lot of camels in India. At that stage, 1.5 million, now it's down to 200,000. They've all gone, basically. And I came across this Raika community who believed they were created by God Shiva to take care of the camel. So they had a real feeling of responsibility for the welfare of the camel. So they never slaughtered it, never used it for meat, never sold the milk, never sold female animals, and their whole identity was based on the relationship with camels, and that fascinated me. And for a long time I thought, this is unique. It's only the Raika who are doing this. But actually, India is full of similar communities who have a pastoralist identity, from the Himalayas down to the southern tip of India, and from the east to the west. We always think of India as it's a country of villages, of farmers, but it is just as much a country of pastoralists. And they've traditionally been integrated with each other, the pastors providing the work animals and also the manure, very important functions. And then in the colonial period, this was all fell apart because the British couldn't control the nomadic pastoralists. They couldn't tax them because they didn't have any land. And at that time, many of them were declared criminal tribes, even.
So I was fascinated to read in your book, Anthony, that the gene that produces attention deficiency, ADHD, that troubles so many school kids, is found in the most successful nomads. So does that not encapsulate a fundamental, perhaps even evolutionary difference between the nomad and the settler?
Yes, it does. in short, I mean, this is fascinating research that's come out of the United States, out of Northwestern University, and if you think, the human story, covers hundreds of thousands, millions of years, and yet, as we were saying earlier, 12,000 years ago, we all lived on the move, and increasingly we have all become settled. There's now more than 50% of us live in urban environment, and by 2050 it's predicted that 75% of us will live in urban environment. And this is a very rapid physical change, and some of us have simply not been rewired to live within the same four walls all the time. And that's what this research suggests. So it's been identified as the nomadic gene. And it came out of research with one particular tribe, the Arial in East Africa, who are, not all nomads are successful, and they're not all as successful as each other. And this gene, this particular gene, the D4DR, was identified in successful nomads in this East African tribe, but it was also found in children in the United States who were diagnosed with learning disorder. Now, the implication is that these children are not wired properly to sit in a classroom and answer a straightforward question, because the set of thinking pattern that you need as a nomad is not the same as the thinking pattern you need to succeed in our increasingly restricted classrooms, where there's no space. The answer is either right or wrong. And it's in a way, it's sort of what this gene might be identified as people who are able to think radically, which is to think digressively, to come up with a series of solutions or answers to each question. And frankly, as far as I'm concerned, and one of the reasons I wrote this book is we as a world are in such a mess that we certainly need diverse thinking. I mean, we need new ideas, and I hope it will come out of this sort of discussion.
Yeah, and presumably it takes a certain tenacity and a certain commitment to be a nomad, too. But there are a number of origin myths from different traditions that you speak about, in which, once again, the settler and the nomad are pitted against each other. So could you tell us about some of these myths and what they perhaps suggest?
Yes, to me, the most obvious myth was Cain and Abel, the original fratricide. These two brothers, one tills the land, one is the farmer, and the other is the herder. It's interesting because in the Bible, it's not explained why God chooses the herder, the offering of the herder over the offering of the tiller of the land, but he does, and out of that comes this conflict, this jealousy between these two brothers, and that's reflected in a way in the Gilgamesh myth, where you have Gilgamesh, the king of this city in Mesopotamia, who is so overpowering and abusive of his people that the people pray to their gods, who send a counterpart, which is this man who lives in nature called Enkidu, and physically these two are a match for each other, and they become friends until Gilgamesh leads Enkidu on a journey that Enkidu says should never be made, to cut down the forest. And in this is clearly an expression in this myth of the destruction of the natural world that has come about through settlement, even in ancient Mesopotamia. This is 3,000, 4,000 years ago, but the story goes back into the dawn. So these stories are about the conflict between the settled and mobile people. And what's curious, and and curious going through the histories is that when nomads come into our conventional histories, it tends to be in moments of conflict, as with these fratricides. But as I said before, for most of history, for most of our existence, the relationship between nomadic or mobile and settled people has been complementary and mutually dependent, as Ilse knows and will tell us. You know, the settled need the mobile in the same way that the mobile needs settled.
So my next question to you, Ilse, also pertains to creation myths. You talked about the Raikas believing that they were ordained by Lord Shiva to look after camels. Most of these creation myths of pastoral communities suggest some sort of a divine duty. So can you give us a few examples and tell us why this is so important?
You find it, and yeah, I mean, there are several examples in India, not just the Raika, but also in Karnataka. There are the Danga sheep nomads. They have a very similar story, also related to Shiva and Parvati. And we have similar traditions among the Fulani in West Africa. So it's, I think most traditional pastoralist communities have a myth of origin that links them to the particular animal they focus on. And this is, you know, that sense of responsibility, it's such a difference to what you learn in modern animal science. You know, as a veterinarian, I was also taught in animal science, where the animal is just a machine, and the whole thing is just about input versus output. How much feed you give to the animal and how much product do you come out. And it's against humanity, actually, to treat animals that way. And this is, I think, one of our current huge problems is the way we relate to animals. And I'm also not surprised that God preferred the nomad, because, you know, nomads they're less materialistic. They can't accumulate a lot of property. They have to keep moving. So they only, you know, they have carpets they take with them. But that's about it, and the tent. So it's a totally different philosophy. So they value hospitality, for instance. They're always very open. Hospitality is one of their biggest values, I would say. And settled people tend to eat themselves out of their environment, as we've seen in Neolithic times. I mean, you overexploit the area around you. And animals have to be kept on the move. I mean, that's what they were designed for biologically. You know, plants are immobile. They have photosynthesis. They can, you know, just create energy from solar energy. And animals and humans, of which humans are one, so they don't have that facility. So in order to get energy, they have to keep moving. And this is a fundamental biological principle. And we've ignored it in our agricultural development by immobilizing animals and then growing the feed for them at the other end of the world and giving it to them. Whereas nomadic pastoralists, their economy is totally solar powered. You know, they produce an enormous amount of food out of waste, basically. So they're absolutely fantastic, and they are, in my book, I actually try to describe how they address a lot of our current problems, like they can help with climate change, they can help address desertification, they can help with conserving biological diversity. They are just absolutely fantastic, but they have been invisible because of that, you know, that agricultural mindset, that settled mindset. And it's really important that we make it visible again.
Yes, I think that's very important. And we often don't neglect those angles, you know, the sense of partnership, affect in the relationships between humans and animals. And historically, in Rajasthani chronicles, animals, livestock, horses, camels, cattle, they would be referred to as mobile wealth. Speaking of horses, your book has some wonderful references to the role of horses in nomadic life. In one instance, you described falling off your horse and dying as the most nomadic of accidents. In another, you call freezing in your saddle a uniquely nomadic death. You write, but there was one change humans brought about that seemed to have only positive outcomes, and it involved horses. Recently, I read an article by the BBC that apparently donkeys had an even larger impact on human civilization, but you do tell us about the equine revolution that sprang in the Eurasian steppes and enabled bands of pastoral nomads to travel to the Indian subcontinent, travel and migrate to the Indian subcontinent, Iran, Egypt, and Greece, among other places.
Yes, okay. Well, so the horse, used to roam very happily a whole way across the Eurasian steppe, and it seems to be around 4000 BC. There was certainly long before that, people were herding horses, and it was available, easy meat. But about 4,000 years ago, they started, 4,000 BC, they started properly herding them, and about 3,000 BC, by then they were certainly riding them. Somebody must have had the brilliant idea of actually, why don't we get on top of this animal rather than just move it around? And but if you ever watched, a rodeo, American rodeo thing, you'll know how difficult it is to tame a horse that doesn't want to be tamed. I mean, they buck and but somebody held on long enough to realize if you just cling on, if you're persistent, you can ride these things. And at that point, this is a complete revolution. 5,000 years of being the most successful mode of transport humans have ever used. I mean, until the early 20th century, we were all dependent on horse transport, and and it changed the world. And as you say, there were bands of horse riders, and soon after the horse comes the wagon, and there was ox wagon first, but then also a horse-driven wagon, which becomes a two-wheel chariot. And transforms the nature of warfare. And I write about this because these warriors who come down, nomadic warriors who come down off the steppes into India, into Mesopotamia, and because they're coming on horseback and because they're coming with chariots, and they're also coming with another great invention of the steppes called the composite bow, which is a bow made of several pieces of wood strung together with gut and various other things, which is very effective. Had a long range, a much greater range than with a single stick bow, and much more accurate. And these warriors who came down, and they came wave after wave after wave, transformed the world. And one example I write about is in ancient Egypt. A group called the Hyksos, who in the Bible come out as the shepherd kings. And this is around 1800 BC. And they eventually overthrow the pharaohs, and they're certainly ruling the northern part of Egypt until the Egyptians learn how to use these two new inventions, the chariot and the bow, and push the Hyksos out. That's 1500 BC, and it's the beginning of the new kingdom in Egypt, which, when you think about Egypt, that is the glory period. It's not the pyramids, but it's Tutankhamun and Ramses II and Abu Simbel and Karnak Temple. So the arrival of these people and the new technology they brought transformed Egyptian culture and forced the Egyptians to change. And I think we see this throughout the world and throughout history, that these bringers of new technologies or new ideas, who might not be welcome initially, but actually what they bring with them and the change they affect turns out to be extraordinary and beneficial.
So this is for you again. A description of the Huns by the 4th century Roman historian Amminus reflects the prejudice, the charges of homelessness and rootlessness faced not only by the Huns but nomads down the ages. They are all without fixed abode, without hearth or lax or settled mode of life, and keep roaming from place to place like fugitives, accompanied by the wagons in which they live. In wagons, their wives weave for them their hideous garments. In wagons, they cohabit with their husbands, bear children, and rear them to the age of puberty. None of their offspring, when asked, can tell you where he comes from. since he was conceived in one place, born far from there, and brought up still further away. Is this the same prejudice against nomads as vagabonds and barbarians threatening the settled order that led to Attila the Hun being considered the scourge of God, and later also Timur?
Yes, in a word. The reason why Attila the Hun was called the scourge of God is partly because that was the title he gave himself, and partly because the story was written by the Romans, and Attila brought down the Roman Empire. So he was never going to get a good press from Roman historians. But this anxiety about foreigners coming and nomadic peoples of all sorts, vagrants, travelers, vagabonds, people who live in the 21st century in what's called wheel estate rather than real estate, who live out of their vans or their trucks. There's always been anxiety among settled people, and there's a great story that comes out of ancient Sumeria, the tale of Martu, and it tells of a Sumerian princess who, so this is 2500 BC thereabouts, who falls in love with a nomad, with somebody who moves around. And her friends are all saying to her, you can't marry this man for these same reasons. Where has he come from? He doesn't have a house. He eats meat. He wears leather. He eats raw meat, actually, and he wears leather. And when he dies, he won't be buried in a tomb, which is not true, because actually nomads, a whole way across Eurasia, built spectacular burial mounds for themselves. But it's the anxiety of settled people of who are these people who are coming to us, and why have they come? What do they want from us? What are they going to take from us? And the questions are entirely, and it goes, 5,000 years of anxiety about people, and the questions are wrong. The question should be, who are these people? Why have they come here? And what can we learn from them? What are they bringing to us? Not what are they going to steal from us? And this, but again, these stories are always written by settled people, and the settled people have an anxiety about it. But it's not borne out by the facts. It's simply not. Although, as I say, Attila the Hun gets bad press from the Romans because he brought down the Roman Empire. So you can understand that. And partly that's also a problem. And it's a problem of writing about nomads, because nomads tend not to leave written records. Mostly not. And therefore, in order to write a book like mine, I've had to rely mostly on the stories of settled people, and then try to get past their prejudice, like when you read the Romans, like Ammianus. So I understand why he's saying this about them, but actually what he's telling us about them is something valuable about how they bring up their children. And yeah, the children might not know where they come from, but as Ilse knows, you talk to Bedouin in Sinai, they certainly know their bloodline. They'll tell you who their father, their grandfather, their great-grandfather, and it's that personal bond rather than physical bond that defines them. And that, in a way, is a definition of the difference between mobile and settled people.
Yes, they do tend to have a pronounced sense of not just lineage, but also geography, which is something that your book talks about, the deep attachment to their way of life. And you do emphasize how there is so much we can still learn from pastoralists. You also talk about, that the modern wariness of pastoralists, the attempts to place them under surveillance and curb their movements, stems from a historical dread of horse and camel riding nomads that stormed so many bastions, something that Anthony just talked about. You write, before the present era of almost universal surveillance, pastoralists could be here today and gone tomorrow. They had the capacity to move into remote areas, to extract themselves from the clutches of central powers and stay incommunicado, so that nobody knew which possibly unlawful activities they were engaging in. So please put this in historical perspective for us, and also tell us how colonial rule in different places institutionalized this dread of nomads, pastoral nomads, and I mean, among colonial records in India, you find files pertaining to nomads and pastoralists that are titled criminal tribes or vagrants. So how does that come about, that kind of prejudice?
So, yeah, I mean, I agree with you that pastoralists or nomads and settled people can be complementary, and I think they are. Most of the time they are, but there have been instances in history where they have been threatening, like the big Chinese wall was built to protect the settled Chinese from the Mongols and other tribes before them, the Xingnu and
yes.
I've forgotten the names. And it's actually something. It wasn't just the British who had problems with nomads in India. I mean, other countries had the same. You find it in Iran under the Shah. Iran is also basically a pastoralist country because it's 90% dry land. And under the Shah, those wandering tribes were also suppressed, and they have been since. Also, the Russian Empire, when they, I think, brought what is now Kazakhstan under control, they also settled the nomads there, and it led to, I mean, millions of people died, I think 4 or 5 millions, because they had to be settled. So it's, yeah, I think it's maybe not the people themselves at the grassroots who are frightened, but it's the rulers, the guys at the top, you know, because they feel their empire is threatened. So this goes back in history, this kind of dialectical relationship. And then, yeah, and then colonialism came, and that was one thing. And unfortunately, after the colonial period was finished, no new approach was taken to livestock development. So after India gained independence, the young animal scientists, they were sent for training to a land-grant university in the US or to Germany or to the UK, and there they imbibed that, you know, that principle of the animal being immobilized somewhere and being fed some particular ration. And out of that comes this disdain for the pastoral nomads that we have. And that's why they've remained invisible. And also because a lot of the other services that are provided by pastoralists are not entering the equation of an animal scientist. It's just one product that counts. Whereas the most important product of Indian nomadic pastorals is actually the organic manure that they deposit directly on the field. It is crucial to India's food security that those pastoralist nomads continue to do that. India is totally dependent on imports of artificial fertilizer, and these pastorals, they help so much, so they need to get the support actually to continue what they've been doing. And so far they're not getting it. Yeah.
I would say that it was exactly the same in ancient Mesopotamia. There was anxiety among the settled of when would the nomads come with their herds to eat the stubble after the harvest and leave their droppings and therefore fertilize the soil. And if they came, would they leave when it was time for them to leave, or would they stay and therefore create problems? Always this anxiety. But there's a detail I want to mention in your book, which I thought was absolutely fascinating, and that is in terms of agricultural land, of farmable land in the world. Only something like, is it either 25% or a third of it is
a third.
Only a third it could be farmed in a
farmed, meaning growing crops.
Meaning growing
yeah.
crops.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of it is not suitable for growing crops, which means the rest of it, 2/3 of what UN calls farmland, is only really suitable for pastoralists, and you know that's an extraordinary statistic.
Yeah. So it's not a marginal thing, actually. It's massive.
It's the majority. It's a
huge.
majority thing. But then the world is dominated by by multinational companies that run our food supply. So there's obviously a problem there. But anyway, you have another question for us, I think.
We're running out of time.
We are.
Oh yeah. Can I add? I need to get this point across. I'm sorry, but so there is all this talk about a lot of young people are becoming vegan because they feel it's bad for the climate and they feel sorry for animals, and that's why they stop eating meat. And I can totally sympathize with that. But it would make much more sense actually if people would selectively consume products from nomadic production systems, basically, because those products are much healthier, and if you use them, eat them, then you actually support those pastoral nomadic systems.
Yes. Okay.
So I'm going to ask the both of you one last question, and then perhaps we can take some audience questions. So Anthony, a Bakhtiari nomad in the Zagros Mountains, had this to say to you: I never wanted to be settled, but we all have to make difficult decisions, and I wanted my children to be educated so they could be part of the modern world. Perhaps the best possible world is one in which we are all nomad and all settled. We can all move and we can all stay home at the same time. Meanwhile, you say, over the last century, we have meddled with the basic principles of planetary design and turned it upside down. Through our human pursuits, especially agriculture, that has wiped out their habitats, we have reduced the planet's wild fauna by more than 90%. Alongside this extinction, we have exponentially increased the number of farm animals, confining and stall feeding them instead of letting them graze or browse on natural plant material and fulfill their ecological functions. You argue that pastoralism is the answer. So both of you, how much can nomadism survive in the future?
I'm sure it will survive. I mean, it's been there for 9,000 years about in an organized fashion, and it's been extremely resilient. And if we have energy problems in the future, we might actually have to go back to just raising animals in a natural way. So I'm 100% sure it will survive. And if it doesn't survive, I think it means we're cutting off. Humanity is cutting off the branch it is sitting on. I mean, we can't just go and eat artificial products produced by corporates with a lot of energy. I mean, this is the most pastoralists pursue the most natural way of food production there is without eliminating biodiversity. They will survive.
But even if it survives, will it not become more and more marginalized?
Well, marginal in terms of numbers, yes, but that statistic that I just quoted out of Ilse's book of that the majority of farmland on the planet is not suitable for industrial farming, and therefore will nomads, will pastoralists, nomadic pastoralists have a role to play? Yes, of course they will. I mean, the nomad I quote at the end of my book from Iran. They all face, whether it's in Iran or here or anywhere, they all face the same pressure from government to settle because of this anxiety, and also because it's difficult to tax people if they're constantly moving around. But and the carrots that get offered are, the first one is healthcare for your elderly, and the second is, as I write about with this guy, is education for your children. You want your children to be part of the modern world, well, then they have to go to school, which means they have to be in one place. But inevitably, I think there will be a revival nomadism, because I think the nomadic numbers haven't really changed very much over the centuries and over the millennia. It's the settled population that has exploded, and it is becoming intolerable in many cities, as we all know. And those numbers may well go down, but I think nomads will carry on doing what they've always done.
Yeah. Just one anecdote. I mean, after the lockdown, a lot of young Raika who had been working in the cities, they came back and they started a herd, and the whole community, each family gave them a sheep or so. So in times of crisis, it's a thing to fall back on. If nothing else works, this still will work.
Well, like I said, both your books are very eye-opening, and I think we'll take an audience question or two. There are about 5 minutes. Oh, there are lots of questions. I think, yeah. Can someone?
Hello. Yeah, my question is to Ilse. Yeah, I just wanted to ask you that you mentioned about the materialistic pull of the settled societies and the detachment of the nomadic communities. So I wanted to ask, what could be the perspective of nomadic communities towards the settled societies, and what would be the modes of partnership for the nomadic community in itself in these contemporary times? Yeah.
The mode of partnership is in food production, in the provision of organic manure by the nomads, supplying that to the settled farmers. And they are not that materialistic, the nomads that I know. They have, even if they become wealthy, they live a very frugal life. And actually, the shepherds in Rajasthan at least, the nomadic shepherds, they make very good profits because there's a big demand for meat. So they are rich in a way in rural terms, and but they don't show it, except maybe by their gold jewelry. But other than that, they live totally simple. They don't spend any money.
I think one important distinction is we keep referring to modern times. By that we mean mechanized times. Like one of the major interdependencies between, say, settled empires and nomadic pastoralists was rearing animals, animal supply, which is not something that is that required or relevant anymore. So obviously, I think it's important to remember that...
Well, I would say, I mean, in Iran, for instance, at the moment, I mean, something like a third of Iran's lamb is produced by nomadic pastoralists in the mountains, because, and as you said, because most of Iran is either desert or mountain, and it's absolutely not suited for sort of settled agriculture.
This is also an important statistic. In India, there are calculations that show that more than 70% of the meat and more than 50% of the milk are actually produced in nomadic systems or people who depend on common property resources. It's phenomenal.
It's very important. That gentleman has had his hand up for a very long time, his arm up. And the thing is, you can approach the authors after the discussion as well.
Yeah, we have 2 minutes.
Yes, 2 minutes. We're running out of time.
Great.
Someone get him a mic quickly.
Hello. The question of the nomads, of course, is part of a very big continuum which includes migrants in the world and people who are displaced for all kinds of reasons. Also, you were discussing very interestingly the difference between pastoralists and settled communities. Within so-called settled communities, we have many virtual ways and some actual ways whereby people also have a nomadic mentality and a nomadic kind of culture. But if we look at the sea and those who live off the sea, the great majority have a nomadic type of culture. In fact, a very bad one, so that in industrial fishing, we have lost 80% of all our fish in the last 70 years. So the question is, can we look at this nomadic question in quite a wide-ranging way, which is cultural, mental, virtual, as well as economic, physical, and political?
I think you already know the answer to that, and that is yes, we can, and not just yes, we can, but yes, we should, and we should for this one very, as we're running out of time, for this one very significant reason, and that is nomadic peoples are absolutely aware of the delicate balance between humans and the natural world, and it is not in their interest to unsettle that balance, but it is, unfortunately, has happened because of settled people. But nomadic people and the natural world live in a harmony.
No, I'm afraid we're out of time, but you can talk to Anthony after the... Sorry, we're out of time.
Dere